You know, um, Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of like absolute crystalline precision.
Right, like engineering.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you fall off a bike, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points a pen at it and says, there it is, that's the problem.
And it's incredibly comforting when things are that binary.
Hmm.
We are just wired to love things that can be seen, measured, and, well, neatly categorized into a box.
Hmm.
Broken or not broken.
Healthy or sick.
Exactly.
Yeah. But then you step into the world of human behavior and neurodevelopment and trauma, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just, it's utterly useless. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that isn't just a little blurry, it is profoundly murky. You can't just point to a brain scan and say, ah, yes, there's the bad personality.
Which is incredibly frustrating for people trying to make sense of the behavior they experience in their daily lives.
Yeah.
The psychological markers don't show up as jagged white lines. They show up as patterns, as defense mechanisms, and as these deeply embedded survival strategies that they often disguise themselves as virtues.
And welcome to the deep dive. That hidden, murky landscape is exactly where we are going today. We are not just skimming the surface of personality traits or, reading you a list of red flags. Today, we are taking a massive stack of data from brain scans that show what social rejection physically looks like, to global leadership studies, to longitudinal research tracking how children develop their sense of self.
It's a huge amount of material.
It really is. And the mission is to decode one of the most misused, misunderstood buzzwords in modern culture, which is narcissism.
Yeah, because the term has been completely diluted. It gets thrown around in internet arguments applied to selfish ex-partners or, used to describe a boss who demands too much.
Right. Everyone's an armchair psychologist now.
Exactly. But that surface-level usage completely misses the true architecture of the condition. Our goal here is to pull back the curtain on the hidden psychological machinery driving human behavior. We are going to explore the deeply intertwined relationship between high standards, perfectionism, covert narcissism, and a really crucial concept known as toxic shame.
We are tracing the behavior all the way down to the emotion, down to the motivation, the core attachment wound, and the unconscious process. Because we want to know not just what people do, but why their minds literally demand that they do it.
Because there's always a mechanism underneath.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this. Let's start by looking at a concept we all deal with: high standards. So think about someone in your life who demands absolute perfection. Maybe it's a manager at work, maybe it's a parent, or let's be honest, maybe it's you.
Right.
Is that relentless pursuit of perfection an admirable work ethic, or is it actually a psychological shield?
That's the pivotal question that separates healthy functioning from deeply destructive patterns. Historically, psychology really struggled to draw a clean line between a healthy dedication to quality and a rigid, self-defeating obsession.
It's a fine line.
It is. But modern paradigms have cracked this open. There is a framework called the model of excellencism and perfectionism. It was developed by a researcher, Patrick Gaudreau, and it introduces this paradigm-shifting distinction. It essentially separates the pursuit of perfection from the pursuit of excellence.
Excellencism versus perfectionism. On a resume, those sound like synonyms, right? Like, I strive for excellence versus I'm a perfectionist. But you're saying they are running on completely different psychological engines.
They are entirely different operating systems. So excellencism is the drive to reach high but genuinely attainable standards. The effort you put in is flexible, you want to do great, you push yourself, but your goals are anchored in reality.
Okay, so there's a ceiling to it.
Right. Perfectionism, on the other hand, is the rigid pursuit of idealized, completely unattainable standards. It's an obsession with flawlessness. To an excellentist, hitting a goal feels deeply satisfying. But a perfectionist will reach that exact same state of excellence, completely dismiss it because it wasn't utterly flawless, and then just continue chasing an impossible ideal.
Wait, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. If I'm an excellentist training for a marathon, I might aim to run it in under 4 hours.
Okay, good example.
And if I run it in 4 hours and 2 minutes, I might be like a little disappointed, but I can look at the data, see that I improved my personal best, feel proud of the training, and just adapt my strategy for next time.
That's a textbook example. You are demonstrating what psychologists call cognitive flexibility. You can discern alternative solutions, adapt your behavior, and, crucially, perceive the situation as a learning experience.
Right.
Research consistently shows that excellentists experience far less burnout, they have higher life satisfaction, and they exhibit strong divergent thinking. which is basically the bedrock of creativity. They bend, but they don't break.
But if I'm operating on the perfectionist engine, running that marathon in 4 hours and 2 minutes isn't just a partial success, it's an absolute catastrophe.
It is a devastating indictment of your core worth. A perfectionist views mistakes not as isolated events or like learning opportunities, but as fatal, permanent flaws in their identity.
Wow.
Yeah, their view of growth is incredibly rigid.
No.
If you are not perfect, you are worthless. There is no middle ground.
But wait, I have to push back on this a little because society constantly tells us to demand perfection, aim for the stars to reach the moon, right? Doesn't pushing for absolute perfection at least guarantee that you'll end up with something truly excellent? Even if you fall short, aren't your standards keeping the quality high?
That is perhaps one of the most pervasive cultural myths we have. The assumption is that perfectionism guarantees a high-quality outcome. But the hidden truth revealed by behavioral science is actually quite alarming.
Okay, what is it?
Perfectionism doesn't guarantee excellence. What it actually breeds is moral disengagement.
Moral disengagement? You mean like cheating?
Yes, including cheating, but it goes much deeper than that. Imagine a scenario where an excellencist and a perfectionist are both taking a high-stakes exam.
Okay.
The excellencist will not tolerate cheating because cheating invalidates the actual achievement. The goal was to master the material. If you cheat, you didn't master it, so the excellence is void.
That makes sense. The internal metric is actual mastery.
Exactly. But the perfectionist isn't trying to master the material, they're trying to preserve the image of flawlessness.
Oh, wow. So if failing means you are fundamentally broken as a human being, you will do absolutely anything to hide the failure.
You will adopt a winning-at-all-cost mentality. If the standard is unattainable through honest effort, the perfectionist will bend their morals to manufacture the illusion of perfection.
So they'll cut corners.
They'll engage in unethical behavior, lie about their metrics, throw colleagues under the bus, or plagiarize simply to maintain the facade. Because the perfectionism isn't actually about the work itself.
It's about self-worth regulation.
Right.
The perfectionism is just a visible symptom of something running deep beneath the surface. It's a defense mechanism against an overwhelming fear of being exposed as inadequate.
That is the crux of it. It's an armor designed to keep shame at bay. And when that fragile self-worth regulation gets entangled with a sense of entitlement and ego, we cross the border into a very specific, highly destructive territory known as narcissistic perfectionism.
So if we know that narcissism and perfectionism can intertwine, how does that actually play out over time? Because there was a fascinating longitudinal study we looked at by Nealis and colleagues that tracked hundreds of adolescents over several years.
Yes, a very important study.
And what they found completely flipped the script on how I always assumed this worked. They found that narcissism drives perfectionism, not the other way around.
The causality is vital to understand here. As these teenagers' narcissistic traits, so their grandiosity, their need for admiration, their entitlement as those increased over the years, their perfectionistic strivings amplified to match it.
Wow.
The perfectionism is actively recruited by the brain to serve the ego.
It's basically hiring a bodyguard for your grandiosity.
Exactly.
But it looks different than the stereotypical perfectionist, right? Because when we picture a perfectionist, we usually picture someone agonizing over their own work at 3 a.m., being incredibly self-critical, just silently suffering because they can't get their own project right.
You are describing self-oriented perfectionism. Narcissistic perfectionists operate on an entirely different vector. They project their impossible demands outward.
So it's not about them being perfect.
Well, they practice other-oriented perfectionism. They hold the people around them, their partners, their children, their employees, to absolutely flawless standards.
And what happens when those people inevitably fail to meet a standard that is literally impossible?
The reaction is swift and severe. The narcissistic perfectionist doesn't just offer constructive feedback. They react with intense anger, profound contempt, or public devaluation. They punish the failure.
So they are essentially using the standard as a weapon. They set the bar at 50 feet, ask you to jump, and when you can't clear it, they use your failure as proof that they are superior to you.
That captures the psychological utility of the behavior perfectly. And this mechanism operates through two distinct strategies, depending on the architecture of the person's narcissism.
Okay, let's break this down.
The first strategy belongs to the grandiose narcissist. They use high standards as an explicit tool for dominance and control. Imagine a CEO who berates their executive team for microscopic errors in a presentation. To the grandiose narcissist, any flaw in a subordinate is an existential threat to their own flawless image.
Right, because their internal logic is like, I am a perfect leader, therefore I only have perfect people working for me. If you make a typo, you are shattering the illusion of my perfect empire, and I have to destroy you to distance myself from your flaw.
The subordinate's mistake is treated as an act of treason against the narcissist's grandiosity.
That's intense.
It is. But then we have the second strategy, which is employed by the vulnerable or covert narcissist. They engage in what researchers call socially prescribed perfectionism, which manifests as perfectionistic self-presentation.
Meaning they're obsessed with how their perfection is perceived by the group.
Yes, for the covert narcissist, perfectionism is a camouflage suit. They are terrified of being exposed as ordinary, flawed, or incompetent. So to avoid the crushing pain of rejection, they preemptively try to look utterly flawless.
Or, and this is where it gets highly manipulative, they constantly complain about how much pressure everyone else puts on them to be perfect.
Precisely. They flip it so they are the victim of everyone else's supposedly impossible standards.
I want everyone listening to pause and really reflect on this for a second. Have you ever been around someone who uses their high standards in a way that just makes you feel perpetually exhausted and inadequate, where their pursuit of quality doesn't actually feel like it's about making the work better?
Yes, it feels heavy.
Instead, it feels like an endless performance designed to establish their moral, intellectual, or professional superiority over you. Because if you have, you might not just be dealing with a type A personality. You might be watching the two faces of narcissism at play.
The concept of the two faces is one of the most important paradigm shifts in modern clinical psychology. Yeah. Because our cultural stereotype of a narcissist only covers one half of the picture.
Right, the loud half.
Exactly. When I say narcissist, your brain immediately conjures the grandiose type, the overt exhibitionist, the person dominating the conversation, bragging about their wealth, demanding VIP treatment. They are bold, charming, entitled, and they score remarkably low on measures of neuroticism.
They just walk into a room and act like they own the building.
They are the cartoon villain of arrogance. You can spot them a mile away. But the vulnerable or covert narcissist is operating completely under the radar. They don't look arrogant at all.
They really don't.
If anything, they look introverted, anxious, hypersensitive to criticism, highly neurotic, and constantly on the defensive.
So they exist entirely in the shadows of the grandiose stereotype. And because their outward presentation is so different, their antagonism is rarely recognized for what it is. I mean, it doesn't look like loud bluster. It often looks like weaponized incompetence. It looks like chronic, self-proclaimed victimhood.
Yes, they play the role of the martyr to perfection.
Walk me through what weaponized incompetence looks like in this context, because I think people hear that term on social media a lot, usually referring to like a partner who pretends they don't know how to load the dishwasher so they never have to do it. But you're saying this is a deeper psychological strategy.
Let's look at the layers of it. On the surface, the behavioral layer, they do the dishes poorly. On the emotional layer, they act overwhelmed and anxious. But when we dig down to the motivational and identity layers, a much darker mechanism appears. By acting incompetent, they force you into a caretaking role.
Oh, I see.
They might sigh heavily and say, I'm just so stupid. I always mess everything up. I can't do anything right.
Which immediately traps you. You can't criticize them now because they are already beating themselves up. You actually have to stop being angry and start comforting them.
You've just identified the covert control mechanism. The self-deprecation is a shield against accountability. It forces you to reassure them of their worth, thereby providing them with the narcissistic supply, the attention and validation that they desperately crave.
Wow.
They dominate the emotional ecosystem of the relationship, not by being the loudest in the room, but by being the most fragile.
That is a wild realization. It's like they've built a massive fortress to protect their ego, but instead of the walls being made of bragging and boasting, the walls are constructed out of complaints, self-flagellation, and highly visible suffering.
Right.
It's a ruthless defense mechanism disguised as a white flag of surrender.
That analogy is flawless. If they suffer the most, they establish an untouchable moral high ground. You cannot attack a martyr without looking like a monster, so they control you through your own empathy.
But this brings up a huge psychological paradox. We have the grandiose narcissists screaming about how great they are and the covert narcissists crying about how victimized they are. They look completely opposite. How can they be the same disorder?
It's a fantastic question, and it was answered beautifully by a massive study published recently. Researchers looked at a huge non-clinical sample of over 1,000 regular people. They mapped out their personality traits, their behaviors, and their internal beliefs.
And what did they find?
Something astonishing. When you strip away basic personality differences, like whether someone is naturally an introvert or an extrovert, grandiose and vulnerable narcissism share the exact same psychological core.
Meaning underneath the bragging and the crying, there is identical programming. What is that core?
Deep, pervasive entitlement and a profound sense of self-importance. Whether they are standing on a stage demanding applause or sulking in a corner demanding sympathy, the underlying unconscious belief is identical.
Which is what?
I am uniquely special, my needs matter more than yours, and I am exempt from the normal rules of human reciprocity.
Wow. I deserve different roles.
Notice.
It is chillingly consistent.
And the researchers found a fascinating breaking point in the data. When they looked at the people who scored the absolute highest in grandiose narcissism, so the top 10%, the most overtly arrogant people in the study, the psychological profile suddenly fractured.
Fractured how?
As grandiosity reaches extreme pathological levels, these individuals suddenly begin exhibiting severe vulnerable traits. The paranoia, the hypersensitivity, the emotional volatility all spike.
Wait, let me make sure I understand this. You're saying that the most arrogant people in the world are actually the most vulnerable. The arrogance isn't their actual reality.
Arrogance is a lid on a boiling pot of vulnerability. The grandiosity is a structural adaptation. It is a psychological scaffolding built early in life to protect a core identity that is profoundly unstable and organized almost entirely around shame.
Which brings us to the most critical layer of this entire deep dive, the emotional trauma layer.
Exactly, the core of it all.
This is the part that I think is going to give people a lot of aha moments. Because if you've ever dealt with someone with these traits, the most confusing part is the volatility. Like, why do seemingly tiny, innocent comments land so heavily?
Right, the disproportionate reactions.
Yeah. You ask your partner a simple question about a dinner reservation, or you offer a minuscule piece of feedback on a spreadsheet to a coworker, and they react as if you just attacked their very soul.
To understand that reaction, we have to look at a concept clinical psychologists call a narcissistic injury. If narcissistics supply the constant admiration, validation, and control they crave is the fuel that keeps their psychological engine running, the narcissistic injury is what happens when that fuel is abruptly cut off.
And the engine doesn't just stall out gracefully, it backfires, lurches, and crashes into whatever is standing nearest, which is usually you, the person who made the innocent comment.
To understand why the crash is so violent, we need to distinguish between two emotions that people often confuse: guilt and shame. June Price Tangney, a brilliant social psychologist, maps out a profound distinction between the two.
Okay, lay it on me.
Guilt is the painful feeling associated with a specific behavior. It is the realization, I did a bad thing.
Right. If I accidentally snap at a friend because I'm tired, I feel guilt. The guilt tells me my action was out of alignment with my values. So I call them, I apologize, I try to repair the rupture.
Exactly. Guilt is a pro-social emotion. It drives repair behaviors. Shame, however, is not about the action. Shame is a global evaluation of the self.
So it's not, I did a bad thing.
No, it is the agonizing feeling of, I am bad. Shame doesn't lead to apologies or repair. It leads to the desire to disappear, to withdraw, to hide, or, crucially, to attack the person who exposed the shame.
Oh, man, I am fundamentally broken, and you saw it, so now I have to destroy you.
So toxic shame is the radioactive core of narcissistic pathology.
It is the dark matter holding the entire disorder together. Their entire psychological structure, the grandiose delusions, the impossible standards, the weaponized incompetence, the entitlement is a massive fortress built for one single purpose: to ensure that this toxic shame never breaches their conscious awareness.
Because if it did,
Because if they actually felt the full weight of that shame, it would psychologically annihilate them. And the neuroscience backing this up is absolutely mind-blowing. It proves that this isn't just an abstract emotional concept, it is happening physically in the brain. There are these incredible functional neuroimaging studies done by Naomi Eisenberger on the concept of social rejection.
her work on the pain of social evaluation fundamentally changed neuroscience. When she put people in fMRI machines and simulated experiences of social rejection, exclusion, or harsh criticism, she didn't just see the emotional centers of the brain light up.
Which is what you'd expect, right?
Exactly. But what she actually saw was activation in the exact same neural circuits that process physical pain.
The actual physical pain matrix, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the DACC, the left anterior insula, And the medial thalami.
Yes, and from an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. In early human history, if you were rejected by your tribe, you didn't just feel sad you died of starvation or exposure.
Being alone meant death.
So the brain evolved to treat social rejection as a literal life or death threat. The alarm bells for a broken leg and a broken social bond use the exact same hardware.
So when you say to a narcissistic individual, hey, I actually don't think that idea is going to work, their brain doesn't process it as a simple difference of opinion. Their brain processes it the exact same way it processes touching a red-hot stove.
The neurological distress is identical. And we know this definitively because of studies done on patients who have undergone surgical lesions in their DACC. Sometimes, to treat incredibly severe, drug-resistant, chronic physical pain, surgeons will lesion that specific part of the brain.
And what happens?
Afterwards, these patients report something fascinating. They can still feel the physical sensation of the pain, but they are no longer emotionally distressed by it. The suffering is gone.
They know it hurts, but they just don't care.
But here is the profound secondary effect. Those same patients also completely lose their concern for the social judgment of others, because the distress of physical pain and the distress of social evaluation are fundamentally wired together in that exact region.
Wow. So if we bring this back to the narcissistic injury, for someone whose threat response system is chronically dysregulated, whose ego is incredibly fragile, a mild criticism isn't just an annoyance. It triggers a massive sympathetic nervous system survival response, a literal threat cascade.
The amygdala fires.
Yeah.
Cortisol and adrenaline spike. And crucially, the prefrontal cortex, the logical, reasoning, perspective-taking part of the brain essentially shuts down.
So they can't think straight.
They cannot process your feedback logically because their brain has declared a state of biological emergency. They're experiencing a narcissistic injury, and the only way to survive the burn of that hot stove is to externalize the threat. They deploy rage, blame, projection, or contempt to crush you, thereby restoring their sense of superiority and internal equilibrium.
Which brings up a huge misconception that I think we really need to clear up right now. When someone acts that ruthlessly, when they lash out without any regard for how much they are hurting you, the common wisdom is, well, narcissists just lack empathy. They're like emotional robots. They simply can't understand human feelings.
That is a pervasive myth, and it is a dangerous one because it vastly oversimplifies the machinery of the mind. The truth is much more complex and, frankly, much more unsettling.
Okay. Unpack that for us.
Narcissistic individuals do not lack cognitive empathy. They can perceive, read, and understand exactly what you are feeling. They are often incredibly adept at reading a room or figuring out what makes you tick.
That's how they can be so charming at first.
Exactly. What they have is severely compromised emotional empathy. They understand your feelings perfectly well, but they refuse to emotionally engage with them.
It's an empathy paradox. They see you are hurting, they know why you are hurting, but it's like there's a glitch in the brain's switching mechanism that prevents them from actually caring.
It is quite literally a biological glitch in a switching mechanism. Let's map out the networks of the brain to understand this. We all have something called the default mode network, or the DMN.
The DF.
Yes. This network is highly active when we are at rest. But more importantly, when we are engaged in self-referential thought, thinking about ourselves, our past, our future, our needs, our image.
Let's use a metaphor. Imagine your brain as a television. The default mode network is a channel that broadcasts 24/7, and it only plays documentaries about you, your life, your problems, your greatness.
A perfect metaphor. Now, in order to truly empathize with someone else, you have to change the channel. Your brain has to actively switch off the DMN, tune out the documentary about yourself, and engage other networks to focus outward on the other person's experience.
And the remote control that changes the channel is the salience network.
Precisely. The salience network detects what is important in the environment and switches the brain's resources accordingly. A key hub of this network is the right anterior insula. Functional neuroimaging indicates that in narcissistic individuals, there is a structural and functional dysfunction in this exact area.
So the remote control is broken.
The right anterior insula fails to suppress the default mode network. Biologically, their attention is anchored to the self.
So if a partner comes to them crying or expressing a deep emotional need, they intellectually see the tears. But neurologically, they're stuck on the me channel. They can see you crying through the window of the TV screen, but they can't turn the documentary about themselves off.
And psychologically, your emotional needs evoke a sense of powerlessness in them. or they threaten their internal control. Your sadness is an inconvenience to their ego.
Right, because it requires them to shift focus.
So what do? They trigger a physical withdrawal, or they lash out with dismissive rage. They might tell you to snap out of it or accuse you of being too sensitive because your emotional processing is inconvenient to their self-interest. They actively choose to ignore your feelings, driven by this deep biological and psychological anchoring.
Okay, we've dug down incredibly deep here. We've looked at the behavioral layer of perfectionism, the emotional layer of toxic shame, and the biological wiring of the DMN and the pain matrix. But this begs the ultimate question, the one everyone always asks. Where does this machinery come from? Are people born this way with a broken remote control? Or is this created in childhood?
The eternal nature versus nurture debate. And this is where we have to be exceptionally rigorous and look at the conflicting data impartially because the scientific community is actively fighting over this right now. We have massive studies pointing in completely opposite directions.
Let's start with the genetic side of the argument, the twin studies.
Right, so a group of researchers conducted a massive study mapping the personality traits of thousands of twins and their extended family members. They utilized highly complex mathematical and genetic modeling.
And what did the modeling show?
The results heavily suggested that narcissistic behavioral patterns are passed down almost entirely through genetic inheritance. This research essentially refutes the idea that your parents' specific child-rearing methods create narcissism.
Wow.
It suggested that if a parent and a child both exhibit narcissistic traits, it is driven by their shared biology, their DNA, not by the parent molding the child into a narcissist.
So under that model, you are genetically predisposed from birth to have this rigid, shame-avoidant, DMN-locked brain structure. You are wired for it before you even speak your first word.
That's the genetic argument, yes.
But wait, we also looked at a totally conflicting study from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the PNAS study, and this one points the finger squarely at the environment.
Yes. And the PNAS study is widely considered groundbreaking because of how it was designed. It was a prospective longitudinal study. Instead of asking adults to try and remember their childhoods, they followed 565 children in real time, starting from ages 7 to 12.
Which is when all this stuff starts forming.
Exactly. That is the exact developmental window when individual differences in narcissism first emerge. They wanted to test two competing psychological theories against each other: psychoanalytic theory versus social learning theory.
Let's break those down. So psychoanalytic theory is essentially the old Freudian idea, right? The idea that narcissism is a defensive mask created by cold, unloving, neglectful parents. The child realizes they aren't going to get warmth or love from the parent, so they put themselves on a pedestal to survive. They become their own source of adoration because the parents are emotionally bankrupt.
That was the prevailing theory for decades. It made intuitive sense to a lot of clinicians. But social learning theory proposes something entirely different. It posits that children adopt unrealistic, grandiose self-views when their parents overvalue them.
Overvalue them how?
The parent treats the child as God's gift to the world, constantly telling them they are more special, more talented, and more entitled to privileges than other children.
Okay, so it's a battle between narcissism comes from being starved of love versus narcissism comes from being drowned in false praise. What did the PNAS study actually find when they tracked these kids?
The data strongly supported social learning theory. They found that the development of narcissism was consistently predicted by parental overvaluation, not by a lack of parental warmth.
Oh, wow.
The children internalized their parents' inflated, unrealistic views of them. They learned the core lesson: I am inherently superior to others, and therefore, I am entitled to special treatment.
And what about the kids whose parents just showed them normal, healthy warmth?
That was the beautiful counterfinding. Parental warmth expressing genuine affection, spending time with the child, and appreciating them for who they are rather than how special they are compared to others, cultivated healthy, high self-esteem. It did not cultivate narcissism.
So it's the difference between a parent saying, you are the smartest, most beautiful kid in the universe and everyone else in your class is an idiot, versus a parent saying, I love you so much and I'm so proud of how hard you worked on that drawing.
Precisely.
One builds a fragile ego, the other builds resilient self-worth. But how do we synthesize this? I mean, we have massive twin studies saying it's all in the DNA, and rigorous longitudinal studies saying it's parents telling their kids they are literal royalty.
When you look at the totality of the science, it points to a classic epigenetic reality. Like many complex human traits, there is very likely a strong genetic predisposition. A child might be born with a temperament that is highly sensitive to social evaluation or prone to cognitive rigidity, or perhaps they have a naturally hyperactive threat response system.
So the hardware is there.
But the expression of that genetic trait is deeply influenced by the environment. The DNA loads the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. Specifically, whether the environment teaches that child to view themselves through the lens of comparative superiority driven by overvaluation or through the lens of intrinsic unshakable worth driven by warmth.
That synthesis makes perfect sense. The hardware might be vulnerable, but the software installed by the parents determines how the machine operates. Which brings us to the macro level, the real-world fallout. Because this machinery doesn't just stay in the family home. These overvalued children grow up. They enter the workforce. They get married. They run companies. And sometimes they run countries.
And this is where the psychological deficits scale up into systemic damage. To understand this, we look at interdependence theory and something called the SPN model status pursuit in narcissism. Narcissistic individuals often rise to leadership positions incredibly fast.
Because they look the part.
Exactly. They are charming, they're bold, they project absolute certainty, and they excel at impression management.
They absolutely kill it in the interview process. They know exactly what people want to hear.
They do. But effective, sustainable leadership requires balancing two primary, often competing motives: getting ahead, which involves status, vision, and ambition, and getting along, which involves collaboration, empathy, and relational care. Narcissistic individuals only care about getting ahead.
They completely lack the getting along gene. Or, more accurately, they will gladly sacrifice the getting along if it serves the getting ahead.
Exactly. And because of this imbalance, organizational psychology research shows a highly predictable pattern of rapid reputational decay. There was a fascinating study on team dynamics that placed narcissistic leaders in group settings. In the first meeting, they are rated incredibly highly by their peers. People think they are brilliant, charismatic, and confident.
On men.
But by meeting 7, which might only represent a few weeks of actual collaboration, they're viewed entirely negatively by those exact same peers.
Because the mask slips, the charm wears off, and their ruthless self-interest becomes obvious. The sources we have outline some terrifyingly common documentary-style examples of how this actually plays out in relationships and workplaces. Let's look at some of these because they perfectly illustrate everything we've talked about.
Let's start with sabotage. The research highlights an example of a man named Jim, a top-performing salesman. He was assigned to mentor a new, younger colleague. Instead of helping him, Jim intentionally gave the mentee terrible advice, setting him up to fail, simply to prevent the new guy from ever outselling him.
Unbelievable.
The narcissistic need for self-preservation and superiority completely overrode any professional duty or relational responsibility.
He couldn't handle the threat of someone else achieving excellence, so he just destroyed them. Then there's the concept of forced alignment. The case study of Tim and Lisa in marriage therapy. Tim was literally offended that his wife, Lisa, preferred wide-open rural spaces, while he preferred the density of New York City. He wasn't just disagreeing with her preference, he viewed her differing opinion as a personal insult.
It's a classic narcissistic boundary failure. He doesn't see his wife as a separate human being with her own inner world. He sees her as an extension of himself. Therefore, any deviation from his preferences is a threat to his ego. He tried to force her into complete psychological alignment with his desires.
Then there's the sheer lack of reciprocity. There was an example of a tech CEO who publicly minimized her own boyfriend's recent promotion at a dinner party. She claimed to the table that he never would have achieved it if she hadn't pushed him and networked for him. She couldn't let him have his moment.
Right, because his moment threatened her spotlight.
She had to steal the credit to turn his success into a prop for her own grandiosity.
And finally, the emotional dismissiveness we analyzed earlier. An example of a husband, Josh, whose wife had just lost her job. Instead of offering comfort, he told her to snap out of it and stop being so dramatic. He possessed the cognitive empathy to know she was sad, but her grief was an inconvenience to his evening. No emotional empathy whatsoever.
When you take those behaviors, the sabotage, the forced alignment, the credit stealing, the total lack of empathy, and you scale them up to global systems, the implications are actually staggering. We're not just talking about bad dinner parties anymore. We're talking about global stability.
The research explicitly connects this to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. Analysts studying these global goals have warned that narcissistic leadership is one of the greatest active threats to achieving them.
Specifically, they point to goals 16 and 17, right? which focus on building peace, creating strong, transparent institutions, and fostering global partnerships.
Because you fundamentally cannot have a global partnership if the leader sitting at the table views collaboration as a threat to their unilateral superiority. A partnership requires the getting along motive, and we know they only possess the getting ahead motive.
It is structurally impossible. Shared decision-making is anathema to the self-maximizing narcissist. They view compromise as defeat.
They will actively destabilize institutions, exploit shared resources, and fracture critical global partnerships just to maintain their grip on power, control the narrative, and protect their fragile grandiosity from the perceived humiliation of having to share the stage.
So let's bring this all together. This has been a massive, intense journey into the human mind.
It truly has. We've moved from the visible, everyday behavior of demanding perfection down into the hidden emotional terror of toxic shame. We looked at the literal neurobiology of the brain's pain matrix and the glitch in the default mode network switching mechanism.
We navigated the complex origins of overvaluation in childhood, all the way up to how this hidden psychological machinery threatens global leadership and international peace.
And to you, the listener, understanding this complex machinery isn't just about playing armchair psychologist. It's not about diagnosing your demanding boss or figuring out exactly what's wrong with your ex-partner.
Right, we aren't doing this deep dive just to give you ammunition for your next argument. It's about recognizing the profound, life-altering difference between chasing excellence because you genuinely value growth and mastery versus chasing an illusion of perfection because you are terrified of being seen as a fundamentally flawed. It is about turning the lens inward and understanding what engine is driving your own standards.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative concept to mull over. In the field of sociology, there is a foundational theory developed by Charles Cooley called the looking glass self. The theory posits that we build our sense of identity based on how we believe other people perceive us. Society is the mirror we use to see ourselves.
We are who we think other people think we are.
Exactly. But consider the tragedy of the narcissistic individual. They are fundamentally trapped in a broken mirror. Because their default mode network is anchored only to themselves, they are unable to genuinely see others. And because of their suffocating toxic shame, they are absolutely terrified of seeing their own true, flawed self.
They're living in a psychological prison of their own making.
Surrounded by distorted reflections, fighting endless wars against threats that only exist in their own minds.
So if that is the trap, this endless, exhausting performance, to avoid shame, what is the way out? What is the antidote for the rest of us who feel the pressure to be perfect?
The ultimate act of rebellion against the culture of perfectionism and the true antidote to hidden narcissism is not lowering your standards. You can still aim for excellence. The antidote is cultivating genuine, radical self-compassion. It is doing the hard, deeply personal work of learning to separate your core self-worth from your external achievements entirely.
Because if your worth as a human being isn't tied to the X-ray machine, if it doesn't depend on projecting a clean, perfect, flawless image to the world, then you don't need to build a massive, exhausting fortress of arrogance or victimhood to protect it. You don't need to control everyone around you.
You can just exist. You can make mistakes, you can learn, and you can connect with others without fear. You can step out of the muddy, exhausting waters of perfectionism and finally see yourself clearly.